this semester, taking advantage of another great guest speaker on campus to continue our series of conversations about digital studies and African American history and culture. So thank you for being here in person, and thanks to those of you who are tuning in online. My name is Trevor Munoz. I'm one of the two co-PIs on the project, and it is my great pleasure today to introduce our outstanding panel for this discussion on critical approaches to Black discourse online. So I will introduce each of the panelists, and then I will turn it over to this afternoon's moderator, the unequaled, fabulous Javon Bickerstaff, to conduct the conversation. So first, our first panelist is Dawn Marie Dow, and she is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology here at the University of Maryland, College Park. Dr. Dow received a PhD in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley. Her research uses a range of qualitative methods, to examine intersections of race, class, and gender within the context of the family, the workplace, educational settings, and the law. Her research also examines how middle-class African Americans respond to and counter perceptions and controlling images as they navigate interactions with law enforcement and educational settings, the workplace, and the broader society. Through 3 research projects, she examined how these intersections shape cultural expectations of motherhood and mothers' approaches to parenting, and she's extended that work looking at how mothers are creating spaces online and the role of social media in getting people involved in activism around these topics. Also, the reproduction of racial inequality within the workplace and the experiences of millennial men of color who are navigating predominantly white college campuses. Dr. Dow's work has been published in journals such as Gender and Society, Journal of Marriage and Family, and Sociology of Race and Ethnicity. Please join me in welcoming Dawn Dow. Our second panelist going down the line is our very own leader of the AADHum project here at University of Maryland, Dr. Catherine Knight Steele. Dr. Steele is a scholar of race, gender, and media with a specific focus on African American culture and discourse in traditional and new media. Her research has appeared in the Howard Journal of Communications and the book Intersectional Internet, edited by Sophia Noble and B. Tynes, whose name I'm forgetting. Brindisha. Sorry. Her doctoral dissertation, Digital Barbershops, focuses heavily on the Black blogosphere and the politics of online counterpublics. She is currently working on a monograph about digital Black feminism and new media technologies. And Dr. Steele, as we mentioned, also serves as the first project director for the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation-funded College of Arts and Humanities grant, African American History and Culture and Digital Humanities, our fearless leader. And our final panelist is Sarah Florini, Assistant Professor of Film and Media Studies in the Department of English at Arizona State University. She earned a PhD in Communication and Culture from Indiana University. Her research focuses on the intersection of emerging media, Black American cultural production, and racial politics in the post-Civil War civil rights movement landscape. Sarah Florini is Assistant Professor in Film and Media Studies, and we are repeating ourselves. But her research does focus on the intersection of emerging media and Black American cultural production, and she's currently working on a monograph titled Blackness, There's an App for That, Racial Politics and Black Digital Networks. And finally, the moderator for today's panel and all of our conversation series, Dr. Javon Bickerstaff, gained her PhD in sociology from Harvard University and works on Black relationships in long-term couples, and she is taking it from here. Thank you, Javon.
Thank you, Trevor. So we're going to jump right on into this conversation. So when we think about this issue of Black discourse online and critical approaches to it, scholars have a variety of entry points and different histories with engaging and researching online spaces. Some look at it as a means to produce and disseminate knowledge. Others look at it as a source of data for interrogating technology and discourse. Others take it as a window to observe interpersonal interactions. And each of you looks at it in different ways. So by way of introduction, when you examine Black folks' engagement online, what do you see it as a window into?
I guess I'm starting. Well, my work always focuses on the intersection of technology and culture. And I'm a big proponent of thinking about the ways in which platform affordances, the characteristics of technology really shape the discourse, are part of the discourse, provide the context to either reproduce or translate existing communicative practices. So I'm interested in the ways in which existing communicative practices get reproduced but also get translated and shifted. But for me, the drum I always beat is the intersection of technology and culture.
So, I mean, I came to looking at what Black folks do online because I was told that Black folks weren't doing things online.
Mm-hmm.
And so the start of my work was just knowing that that wasn't true, kind of intuitively, because I was there and there were a bunch of other folks there with me, and trying to then make sense of, one, why the practices of what Black folks were doing online weren't being picked up. What institutionally, what methodologically, what were we bringing as researchers to work about discourse online that was missing these spaces, and that led to a whole long time of thinking about what those spaces look like, how they were constructed, why they were constructed, and why sometimes those constructions intentionally missed the view of other folks. And so that led to a lot of thinking on my part about why people separate themselves from dominant groups online in similar ways that they do offline, and what that meant for their interaction with technology and with each other in those spaces. So like Sarah, I'm very interested in that intersection of what people are doing online in ways that mirror what they do offline, but how their interaction with technology in some way shapes the discourse or shapes the dissemination of that discourse, shapes who has access to it. And that's where I kind of come into Black discourse online and critical approaches to studying it.
Well, my research looking at African American mothers' blogs really started offline for me. I was engaged in qualitative interviews of Black middle class and upper middle class women, and one of the things that came up in those interviews was a feeling that the spaces that other people who were in their same class but who were white might go to for advice were places that they felt alienated from and they felt didn't really serve them in terms of resources. And people mentioned a couple of sort of blogs that they went to that were different. And so I became interested in trying to understand how people were using those spaces, how people who were deciding to create blogs, what kind of communities were they creating those blogs for, what motivated the production of those blogs, what kinds of strategies were they talking about using in their day-to-day lives. And in some ways it was, very much sort of connected to that initial research and wanting to understand whether or not certain inequalities or certain challenges or certain strategies were playing out differently online. And sort of that's a sort of classic sociological question around these sorts of things is, are the inequalities from the offline world being imported into the inequalities on the online world? Sorry, I'm going to start tripping over the words a little bit. Or are something else happening in these spaces, right? And are these spaces being used for different kinds of motivations, meanings, or strategies that are beyond what people can do on their offline day-to-day life? So that was really very much a connected sort of project. And of course, that delving into the online world then opened up additional questions once I got there. But the initial sort of shifts of the online world was prompted by discussions I'd had with mothers in the offline world.
Before we move on, to echo what my co-panelists just said, I have the same experience of feeling like my research grew out of my personal networks, not vice versa. And so I was operating in digital networks that were heavily African American, and I saw folks innovating. Like I have not yet completed the research so I don't have all the data for this, but I maintain that if Black folks did not create live tweeting, they certainly were at the very cutting edge, pioneering of that. Black folks anticipated the podcast boom by like 2 years. So consistently, I was seeing folks doing really interesting work, innovating, being ahead of the curve, and then I would go to conferences, and everyone would be just completely, it would be completely invisible.
Can I also add something to that, just sort of echoing what Catherine said? For a long time, sociologists, one of the dominant ways people talked about the digital world was through this lens of the digital divide, right? But there's a lot of research, or at least even early on, that suggested that at least among middle class folks, that this is not the case, and the digital divide has not been completely obliterated. It still exists, but but there's actually a higher representation of African Americans once they make it online who are producing original content and trying to have outreach and sort of have their points of view expressed in ways that then is similar. Sorry, what's the word for it? The same commensurate whites. That's not the right word. I'm using the wrong word, but that once they get online, they're more likely to produce content than their equivalent white counterparts.
So all of you have brought up the kind of presence and absence of folks doing a lot of digital engagement, Black folks doing that work, as well as the absence of it in some of our scholarly spaces. One of the things that's interesting to me in this particular historical moment is despite this kind of repeated push to imagine America as colorblind and all these assertions that we inhabit a post-racial society, many of the kind of cultural producers that you guys study and that we reference are offering a really clear counter-narrative to that assertion and to those mythologies, right? We see it in the blogs, we see it on Twitter, we see it when Issa Rae asserts that she was rooting for everyone Black at this year's Emmy, 2017's high point of peak Blackness, until ABC's premiere of Blackish, in which case we went to peak Blackness. And so Black blogs and podcasts and Black Twitter are really invoking and celebrating Black racial identity and culture and experience. And so they're vital to that pushback. How do you see them centering Black experience in the research you do?
So I did my dissertation project on the blogosphere as well, right? And predicated that a lot of, if not most of the blogs that I was studying could be classified as Black middle class spaces. There were spaces where people had the time, right, to blog during the day, had the freedom of their profession to spend hours doing that, of cultivating that, right? So there's reasons why that was, but it's important that I say that, right, that they were very middle class spaces. But what those folks who were employed somewhere and were earning incomes that put them into the middle class and were educated in ways that put them into the middle class in some ways, were doing on the blogosphere was recentering their Blackness. And they were doing it during an era where I was studying that post-racial ideology was the mantra. I would argue we've probably gone past that, right? We're post-racial, right? But during this kind of post-racial period, that was the world that a lot of Black folks had to exist in at work, at home, if they were living in communities that did not look like them, right? They had to exist in a space where post-raciality was the mantra. But online, they were not existing in those spaces. Online, they were creating spaces that were intentionally separated from the view of the dominant group, where they were doing the same things that they potentially would have done previously, I argue, in places like the church and the barbershop, right, that were essential community checkpoints. And to be able to do that work in spaces where they were not monitored and were not surveilled was really important during that period. And it remains important today, but I think it's made manifestations in different platforms and in different modes of discourse online now. But it was a really important time for people to be able to assert a technical skill in a way that allowed them to do the work that their communities had always done, that Black discourse has always done, that has always found a way to do in a variety of modes and mediums previously, right? But there was something that was able to happen in those spaces that was important in that moment, and I think created the possibility for, frankly, a Blackish to exist again, right? Like that created a space where we're centering Black folks, Black thought, Black experience in the public view. We see in much more public ways that do interact with the dominant group again. You have to remember at this time also was this kind of dearth of Black families on TV, right? So we're kind of taking for granted that we have an Issa Rae and a Blackish and all the things in the sitcom land right now that really didn't exist between the period of the end of the Cosby Show and the late 2000s, right? Like this was not the wave of what pop culture looked like in terms of television. So those opportunities to recreate spaces that were familiar with new people, with unfamiliar folks, was really central to the ability of people to say once again that I'm going to center myself in a conversation that usually I'm excluded from, right? I'm going to recreate a space to do things that I need to do for me and for my space and my community.
I feel like I just cite the heck out of her work because we're talking about very similar issues, just on different platforms and in different mediums. And so the network that I talk about, which I conceive of as a trans-platform network that includes independent media producers and podcasts and social media. It's the same group of people that are transversing across these platforms. And it was, when I started my book project, it was a place where people sort of showed the lie of the post-racial, right? And pointed out the ways in which race was being erased and gave voice to their own personal experiences. Now I agree with Catherine that that has become untenable. I think that if you have to do some real mental gymnastics to insist now that we are colorblind and post-racial in light of the last year, really. But thinking about a lot of the folks that I'm writing about as well are educated, middle-class professionals. And I've been writing a lot about podcasting and the ways in which I use Boris Nunley's book about hush harbors, African-American hush harbors. And he talks about African-American hush harbor rhetoric. And he talks about it as a communicative practice that has traditionally happened in these spaces, barbershops, beauty shops, churches. And he talks about it as a mode of communication that is not just about ways of communicating, but contains very deep epistemological standpoints. It contains Black rationalities and Black hermeneutic frameworks that, and he talks about the ways in which going into these spaces, he has this great turn of phrase where he says it's where Black folks go to rebaptize themselves in Blackness, to be, after having to navigate this world that is very hostile. And I see that again and again with these podcasts, and particularly amongst the listeners, where people talk about being the only Black person in the office, the only Black person at their PWI, and how they listen in their headphones, and it's like being at the cookout, or being at the barbershop, or being in, they invoke these spaces of African-American hush harbor rhetoric, and sort of this way of packaging that and taking that with them into these Black contexts.
And I think
these white contexts.
Yeah, that's what was exciting to me about starting to do that work, right? Because at the time I started to write about the Black blogosphere, I was working in marketing at a big firm in Chicago, right? And I was the only one of many doing the thing. And then on my lunch break, I went to Bossip, right? And it was a long time ago. Bossip was a different place. But Bossip and the YBF, right? So the Young Black and Fabulous were the sites of the day. And so I was on there during my lunch break, and I realized that I was on there, and then the one other Black person in my office was also on that site, because I saw her comment come up, and I was like, hey, wait, there's something, right? And so there's this moment that was really exciting that, like, wait, I can research these spaces that are really significant and that are really familiar. There's a real deep familiarity to what's happening here, and that when I'm studying this and coming from the disciplinary background that I do, right, that I was invoking things about rhetoric and Black rhetorics that I had been learning in offline spaces, right? So I'm hush harbors, and we're thinking about barbershops, and we're thinking about, you know, things about how slave traditions of creating songs and jokes and signifying practices, that all of these things are happening in these spaces. And so it was a deeply familiar experience, which was really exciting as a young graduate student, that like I could study a space that made sense to me, that wasn't being looked at. I'm really, really happy that it is now, and so that I can probably stop telling the story of like, when I started, no one was studying it. But it's a different place now for that kind of research.
Yeah, I mean, I guess have a sort of slightly different entry point into this, because I have been very sort of, in terms of thinking about the spaces that I'm looking at, they're not spaces that are as conversational as other spaces are. So the blogs I'm looking at are spaces where people are creating content and trying to sort of create a projection of who they are and who their family is, and sort of saying why they've started the blog and trying to figure out what sort of resources they're trying to bring to bear on the blog. So there's not this, as much as this conversational element where people are coming in and, but they are depicting an image of who they are. And so what I found, I mean, that this is, you know, from collected blogs that have looked at, that have been created by primarily Black middle-class moms, some who are in monoracial marriage situation where they're married to a Black man, or someone who is of Black racial identity, but maybe someone from African descent, or some people who are multiracial and interracial relationships, and others who are single parents as well. and trying to understand why have they decided to create this space, what things they think are important for people to understand in the outside world as a, from their perspective. And it's a very specific perspective. I'm looking at it from the perspective of Black moms raising kids. And a lot of the things that you're talking about in terms of post-raciality, you see playing out on these sites. And what has struck me about that experience is that, you know, we have a tendency, and I know that this is not a tendency that's happening on the panel, right? But there's a tendency to sort of think about a Black public, or a Black voice, or a Black perspective. And what has struck me about looking at these blogs, this collection of blogs, which I should point out that Melissa Brown over there has helped me add to over the last year and a half, is that the diversity on them in terms of how people are really contending with these issues of post-raciality and post-raciality. So there are some mothers who are really using this as a space to say, people aren't talking about these sorts of things in my community. You're gonna come here and you're gonna see a Black mom talk about Black issues and politics and race and raising Black kids and the challenges that I confront. And I might add a hair tip in for my daughter every once in a while, right? That's sort of the framework, right? And here's this great product.
Yeah.
And then there are other people who are, you know, really kind of using these spaces more to kind of create a space where I would say that they can be a mom, but not have to necessarily have Blackness be the centralness to their momhood, right? Like they want it to be a part of it. So like, you know, there are posts about Black History Month and about, you know, cultural issues around helping with their hair care, or like, oh, there's an event that we go to, but they don't want it to be as politicized a space, right? And these are the mothers who are really confronted by the fact that we are in a post-racial society, because it's hard to, in the sort of societal reception that people are experiencing in their offline worlds, right, to not then have that challenge some of the rules they've established on their online, which I think has been very interesting. So for example, you know, there were people who typically didn't talk about racial politics on their blogs, but talked more about it from a cultural perspective, would have these momentary lapses, right, where Trayvon Martin happens, and they're like, okay, I'm sorry, which is interesting, a kind of an interesting, like, linguistic dynamic that happens online, but I can't leave this alone. I have to say something. I try to just be a mom and talk about happy things, right? But somehow this idea of being a Black mom challenges that for them, right? So for me, I think it's interesting to see how the diversity and how Black people are contending with and negotiating, talking about what it means to be a Black person online, and also thinking about the different publics that they think they're talking to, because some of the folks on the line very much are cultivating a public of Black mothers, or at least very strong allies, whereas others are trying to translate their experience to people who don't understand, who might not understand it, right? Who they feel as though that they have to apologize to first before they can have those conversations. And those sorts of dynamics exist in the offline world, right? I mean, people talk about, there's research, sociologists who talk about, like, what are the politics, or what are the rules, the taken for granted rules about talking about race or racism in conversational dynamics and spaces that are like interracial. And I mean, for me, it's interesting to see when and how those conversational dynamics get pulled in, and when do people say, sorry, this is a space, if you come here, you're coming for what I have to say, and I'm not gonna apologize about it. I'm just gonna, and then there's a kind of interesting intersection about the fact that the mom blogosphere, right, is a sphere that is profitable, right? So some people came on with a particular agenda, and this is something that I would like to talk about in the method section, but the problem with tracking blogs, because people do sometimes, like, they had one persona, and then suddenly, you know, Disney wants to,
somebody bought the site.
somebody saw the site and sees that it has a lot of travelers, and then how does that shift the message that you see, which is a whole, you know, thinking about it from a perspective of how economics can interfere or challenge, like, the kind of activism that was playing out previously. So, yeah.
So one of the things that all of you have mentioned is that there are some similarities and some differences in thinking about what we do online and offline, and studying things online and offline. And so, hearkening back to what Sarah Florini has called iconic spaces of Black sociality, right? The beauty shop and the barber shop and the Black church, these kind of enclaves that afforded certain freedoms to be outside of the white gaze, to perform in a certain kind of way. And there's a lot of ideological work that goes on in those spaces. Harris Lacewell talks about it allows for the construction of worldviews and collective identity. And yet, despite some of the similarities in aims and functions, the Black online space is also different in some ways. The most kind of obvious is that things stop being private in some ways when things are online. And Andre Brock has noted that moving these enclaving practices to digital spaces increases the likelihood that the conversations are going to be overheard by outsiders. And so when it comes to studying these spaces that have similarities, that have differences, as Catherine pointed out, you saw some of the same kind of rhetorical practices online that you see in offline. How do we study them differently? Do we study them differently? Should we study them differently?
Well, one thing I'll say is, I mean, I think about like sitting on the bus with my friends in high school, like coming home from school. And depending on which direction you're going in Chicago, the bus changes colors very quickly, right? So if it's a group of my friends going north in Chicago, the people around us don't look like us very much for a while. But the words that we use insulate our conversations in ways, even when there are people physically present around us, right? And those are the same kinds of practices that you see happening in the blogosphere, on Twitter, et cetera, of people using signifying practices, right, that Sarah's talked about a lot in her work, using cultural mainstays that are specific to the Black community, right, and this translates to different things like hashtags and et cetera, right, but operates outside of hashtags too, right, operates in ways that African American vernacular English is structured, or references to movies or to songs or to things that are outside of the popular mainstream kind of white culture, right, so that I can have a conversation with you in front of someone and they really not know exactly what I'm talking about is not new practice, right? And so this is where we come in talking about practices during enslavement, right? Of people finding ways to mask dissent, to mask words in song, right? To be able to do things directly in front of someone else without them understanding exactly the goals and the direction of what's happening exactly. Now, I think Andre Brock is exactly right that it does open up spaces that sometimes were more guarded, right? So Black churches have their doors open, you can go, right? But just like blogs do, right? Like if you know what site to look up, you can get to it. Podcasts, Sarah talks about as being even harder to do that with, right? But Twitter is a lot more open in that way. It's a lot easier to stumble upon than it is. But a lot of the blogs I originally started studying weren't owned by larger companies, right? And so the communities that were built there, unless you knew what site to drive to, there was not a really amount of Googling Black blogs that was gonna pull those up. Some of that has changed because some of them have been purchased by larger media conglomerates and that changes some things. But getting to those sites was one thing. Understanding what was happening on those sites was quite another. Being able to participate in the conversation was yet a third component that is all guarded at various levels by how people interact with one another. So what I say is that you have to bring to the study of Black discourse online an understanding of Black discourse, right? And so the idea that I am going to be able to use search terms to find all the Black people on Twitter and then understand and be able to analyze what they're doing is as problematic as having transcripts of Black conversations dropped in front of you with no knowledge of the people that are having those conversations, how those conversations happen, or the legacy of how their discourse formed over time. So I bring to the study of the Black blogosphere, having studied how Black folks talk and interact with one another for centuries, right? Like that is important knowledge to bring to studying the discourse in that space.
And as someone who, and I know this is going to be shocking to you all, I am not Black. As someone who is not Black, I had to learn those cultural competencies, right? That I had to put in time and effort to understanding those communicative traditions and understanding those cultural commonplaces. And it is amazing how opaque I think those practices can be. For example, when I use examples with my students in class in predominantly white classrooms, things that I would think people could figure out from context clues, they're just like, I don't understand what is happening here. So there is an opaqueness to the tradition. And then I'm completely obsessed with how affordances in either enhance or decrease that opaqueness. So podcasts, so glad that Serial happened and now everyone cares about podcasts, because I'm obsessed with podcasts. Podcasts, you have to know that they're there, just like the blogs. You have to find them. You have to go listen to them. All of the podcasts that I write about are all, they don't use traditional radio formats. They're often 2-3 hours long. Right? There is a time investment there. There's no, if you want to troll somebody on Twitter, you can just throw in a hashtag, find some people who are tweeting about that thing, call them a couple of racial slurs, and keep it moving. Where if you want to troll like a podcast, you got to sit there and there's no searchability, there's no scanning, there's no, and then you have to be fluent enough in the communicative practices, and because the podcasts come from all over the country, you've got a range of different regional vernaculars and regional cultural commonplaces. So even if you find it and put the time in, you may not know what folks are talking about.
So both Catherine and Sarah have talked about this kind of what you call high context needs, right? When you're entering these spaces. But Dawn, it seems that some of the blogs that you look at with motherhood are about trying to speak to a really different audience.
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think sometimes the audience is a Black audience that doesn't want to necessarily have to always talk about race all the time, but they're creating a space where people can just think about, like, motherhood without having to think about race all the time. But there's definitely some of these blogs, and there is, you know, from examining them in terms of patterns, it's not necessarily, like, there's not, like, a necessarily more common for, like, a Black woman who's married to a non-Black man to be talking to a particular audience. Sometimes it's a Black family who's in a predominantly white context and they're talking to that. But sometimes a Black family might say, I'm not using this space for that. I'm using my blog space to, you know, be able to talk more freely about these things. So, yeah, so there are different kinds of audiences that these blogs are trying to talk to. And I think that for some women, the motivation, some mothers' motivation is to have a space where they can think through the challenges that their families and that their children and that they and that their spouses confront as they navigate racial stigma in society and try to process that. And I don't want to say that these spaces don't have, like, well, there's a lot of joy on these blogs as well. So, like, I think that a lot of times when we think about these spaces, there's a tendency to sort of think about the challenges people are confronting on these spaces, but there's kind of a strong exercise of, like, joy in people's families. But having said that, there's some spaces where issues around race are coming up more. And then, like I said, there are other spaces where people really seem to be taking on the task of trying to find a way of communicating how their experiences are distinct as Black mothers raising Black children to non-Black audiences. So, and that takes, and they talk about the labor in that, the emotional labor that's involved, right? And so for me, it's talking about these issues of, like, being immersed in sort of the vernacular and the types of knowledge you have to have coming into this. I mean, obviously, I am a Black woman, since we're calling out. But in addition, having spoken to people for a number of years who are Black women offline, right? In some ways, I can see how are some of the things they talked about offline, which is playing out online, if at all, and then how are they taking up these things differently, and how are they maybe even broaching different topics that were not necessarily addressed in the interviews that I did with them offline.
I mean, what's kind of cool about the study of these spaces to me is making the distinction between blogs that deal with race and blogs that are just dealing with Blackness. And those are two different things. So being able to draw a distinction, as you mentioned about the publics, right, and how folks are choosing to interact with their imagined publics or their very real publics. I don't say imagined as though they don't exist, right? But publics that are not necessarily, sometimes it's not a counter public in the sense that people are not trying to engage with the dominant group in some way to change some system, right? That the joy and the reveling in Blackness is not necessarily about reveling or engaging in a racial discourse about strife and contention and fixing, right? It's here we are and this is who we are, and you can watch if you want to. I really don't care because I'm not doing it for the watching.
And this
right?
is why
it's not performative.
And this is why, like, trying to understand what the apology is when people do talk about it is an interesting point, right? So Because some of the spaces that are being created by the mothers that I look at, they're really about saying, I want you to come here and like learn about Black cultural history and icons and how awesome we are as a group, and come here for empowerment, and I'll give you some like, for those who have young daughters, there's a lot of sections on hair tips. So, but that's another area, but like I'm gonna have you come to a space where we can talk about those things. Like if you go to parenting.com, there's not a section about how to deal with natural hair, right? But here, if you come here, there's a whole list of products that I've used, and it's not about, and so when people, so sometimes you feel like the apology, and it's usually clear from the context of the apology that's being said, is that I'm disrupting the space that I was trying to cultivate as a place of empowerment, but I feel as though I have to apologize to have this discussion that's saying like, I'm sorry that this was supposed to be this like revelation of joy, Black joy, and then other cases it's like, I'm sorry, I know that there are people who come to the site that are like not Black and who are also Black but don't want this, but it's like kind of a more multi-layered apology of like, I don't want to have this discussion. Like it's not supposed to be it's supposed to be a site about Blackness or about motherhood and Blackness sometimes. So there's 3 different ways of thinking about that, but not one that's fully addressing racism on a regular basis.
And it's interesting that you talk about this markedness of apology, because a lot of the folks in the network that I write about create content. They have blogs, they have podcasts, they have things about just general popular culture, and I used to see a lot of those apologies or hear a lot of them, and they've been getting less and less, just fewer and fewer as time goes on. So it used to be, I know that we're a podcast about video games, but I'm sorry.
I know this is a blog about hair, but
I have to talk about this. And that it really is sort of this moment of pivoting from, look, we just want to be here and be us and be relatively unmolested by the white gaze. We don't want to have to code switch. We don't want to have to deal with hostility. We just want to like enjoy our video games and not have to worry about any of that sort of, and then this switch into, and now we're dealing with these explicit racial issues, and then as time has worn on,
What I think is interesting about your point here is that in what context is it not something where we have to apologize, right? So like, I think about this a lot. So are there spaces where you don't have to apologize for having that moment where you're like, and there's a racial element here. So far mothering's not one of them, and video games not either. And then there are other spaces where, it's the normative discussion is to take race out of it, right? And so when it's introduced, and so it makes me think about what kinds of sort of publics have to be created. And so from thinking about it from my own research lens is, so there's some people who are actively constructing publics where they don't have to have that apology, and as well as the ones you guys are talking about as well, that they're creating spaces where it's just taken for granted that we're going to be talking about both Blackness as well as racialness, as well as racism, as well as
gender,
as well as
right, and all the things. And so, I mean, it reminds me of the most recent, like, kind of blow up over the Very Smart Brothers post that was about Black men, right? So, if you're not familiar, there was a post that Damon from Very Smart Brothers, who was here on campus last semester on a panel, wrote that. Somebody give me the title. It was that Black men are the white men of Black people. Yeah, which is something that lots of people. Okay, so Black men are the white men of Black people. Okay,
which is something Ron from the Black AADHum Tips, one of the podcasts that I write about, has been saying, and he didn't originate it.
No, I mean, and so Damon kind of traces, like, I've been hearing this for years. This isn't my expression, but I'm gonna put it out there because it's the best way I can lead into explaining some things about patriarchy that we don't really like to talk about in this Black space that's called Very Smart Brothers, that's, started by 2 men who I would deem write a lot of Black feminist work and put a lot of Black feminist assertions into their work, right? But the blow up over that is a reminder that that was a space that I feel like they've been talking about gender and gender issues for forever, right? But that particular one, now that they're on a platform that's much bigger and has a much broader audience, had a bunch of follow-up pieces where people were saying, wait, listen, it's okay, he did this thing. You should really pay more attention to it. It's not as bad as you think it is. If you did the reading, you would get it, right? And it wasn't an overt, I'm sorry for having to bring this up, guys. This isn't the space for this. But it was a moment, I think, of recognizing the pushback from a created public that's changing right? And so this is why the platform and how people are disseminating becomes really integral to what I do and what I think about, because Very Smart Brothers, when I started reading about it, was a really tight-knit community, a small community of folks. It's grown in ways that are really interesting, and I'm really happy for them, for the growth that they've had. But it has invited a lens, and it has invited a view of their work that sometimes requires more explanation now. And so seeing the writing change and seeing the discourse change from a space that was, I think, very insular in some ways, to a space that now, well, this is going to get picked up by HuffPost, and this is going to get picked up by, right, which means that sometimes I have to change how, or I have to describe a term, or I have to explain what this looks like a little bit more, and not necessarily ever apologize for my analysis of this, but I do have to provide more context, and I have to ease some folks into this in ways that maybe I wouldn't have had to do before. And so this is why I think it really matters that we study alongside the discourse, right, that what the content is. It matters where it lives, and it matters how it got there, right? So it matters that BSBs went into partnership with another, entity that opened that up. That matters, and it translates to offline space. And so this is the thing that's always puzzling to me, is that if we were going to be talking about a Black church and the discourse that happened in it, we'd talk about the church. We talk about where it was, and we talk about the parishioners and who was there and who the minister was, and it would matter sometimes what the physical space looked like. It would matter how many people could fit in the congregation, right? So the ways that we study Black populations and groups and communities offline, we have to think about the architecture of the places that we study them online in the ways that we naturally would do as a part of our methodological approach to doing qualitative and critical work offline.
So, Catherine, it seems in what you just said that there's a critique there about some work that gets done that looks at content, but it looks at it divorced from interface and technology. What are the risks in doing that, and why are you so insistent on making sure that that work is done?
I feel like that was at me, but I'm going to let everybody.
That question is open to the panel, but you're the point of departure.
There is a critique there. I mean, I think that there's a critique of, part of it is this space of we've been doing this a while, and we're protective of the work, right? But part of it, I think, is I want people to do good work, whether that's in digital spaces or not, right? I want them to be as attentive to method and approach and literatures when they're doing Black digital work as they would do in anything else. And I don't want to see there be a cool thing for us to study, right? Black Lives Matter happened, it's cool, let's study this online, and let's divorce that from all that we know to be true about what good work looks like and what good research needs to do and should do, right? So I am a bit, on that side of, hey, you've been trained in this. You know that we're supposed to pay attention to things like ethics. You know that we're supposed to pay attention to things like method. Don't let that fall away because there's this new digital space that we're interrogating. And let's not be so blindsided by describing the content, which I think is important, that we negate doing the other work that's important as well.
Well, and this is something that my background, I was trained as a critical cultural media studies scholar. So I was trained by folks that did film and television and cultural studies. And one of the gripes, I feel like every medium has its moment where it becomes the new hotness and it becomes very popular, and people confuse use with analysis.
Yes.
And so I have a colleague that I like very much, Dr. Al Martin, who is a television scholar, who will often say, just because you own a television doesn't make you a TV scholar. And I think that there is, particularly because digital media moves really fast. So in the rush, I've seen this cool new thing. I feel like it's only going to be relevant for a while.
Yeah.
It is part of my everyday life, so it feels familiar. So I'm just going to jump in and start writing. And so now you're seeing this across the board, I think, with a lot of media studies scholarship, is that you're seeing people reinvent the wheel. And I'm coming back to what Catherine is saying of why? If you could just you could read this, you could think about these things that have already, the foundation that is there for you, and then you could do such amazing work by building on top of it. But instead, we're not talking to each other, and everybody's just sort of doing in their own silo.
Yeah, it's
I mean, I feel like this is an area where there's a lot of in terms of disciplinary promise because, like sociology, for example, I think it's one of those untapped, like, there's a space to go out and do research. Not a lot of sociologists, they're starting to take up doing research in these areas. And I think, particularly the idea of change and shifting of these spaces is really an interesting finding as well as an interesting challenge to methodologically studying them, right? So, I mean, I know I started studying the spaces that the blogs that I was looking at several years ago, and one of the things that's been really useful in having that time is to sort of see the evolution of the very things that you guys are talking about. Like, so a blog looked very different when it first started off, right? There was this woman who had had a picture of herself and her child and, a couple of, like, it was very basic blog. And then suddenly that you see different refreshes of that happening. And that's connected to the audience that she's now, the context that she's in, the kinds of economic ties that she's developed, the community that she's situated in. And without having had the time to look at how different blogs evolve, right? I got to go back, and you probably have all heard of Wayback Machine. Like, to go back and see what this blog looked like when I first started, to see this sort of evolution, because it is a moving target, and I'm not like siphoning off all the information at one period of time. You get the chance to see how the various methods that we think of as being fairly static, where you have an interview transcript and you have it, it's there, and obviously you have the context that you have from transcribing that document. It's very different, and even using like content analysis, if you have like particular data that you're looking at, it's very different thinking about spaces that are constantly evolving and changing, and even like the blogs are being updated, and it's a challenge.
So, two questions about that.
Can I add before you? I think it's so important to think about this interdisciplinary promise of this moment that we're in. I also think it's really important as academics to recognize the structural and professional limitations that might keep that promise coming to fruition. Because there are disciplines where you don't cite people outside of your discipline. That's just not what you do. If it doesn't exist in your discipline, that research basically doesn't exist. There are people from different disciplines that I think should be co-authoring, bringing their sets of knowledge together. But in the humanities, you need those single author publications. If you're gonna, social scientists and people in the hard sciences are working together, generating multiple publications from one set of data, looking at it from all these different lenses. But if we do that, then it's a real hard sell to the tenure committee.
It's a risk,
right?
I mean, but this is where I plant a flag that we'll find out how it works out for my life. But I think that, new media scholarship and internet studies has to be interdisciplinary to have some weight behind it, because and it's why I'm grateful that I was trained in a discipline that allows for interdisciplinarity in terms of the literatures that I explore, right? Because I just don't know how I would do the work if I were only citing my discipline. Because there are folks in lots of places doing lots of things that are very relevant to what I'm talking about. And if I don't have the opportunity to know all of that, and I think that I'm starting from scratch every time I start writing, I am really spinning wheels and wasting, in my perspective, some time and some energy in places that have been talked about and have been talked about well. And to Sarah's point, how can I then build, right? So I've had this conversation with a lot of folks that I've had the pleasure of working with on AADHum, a lot of great grad students on our campus that are interested in doing digital Black work. And I'm saying, somebody's written what you proposed so far, but this sentence at the end of your proposal is really interesting because no one said that yet. But if you know what you need to know, then you can move the ball forward for all of us. And so it's kind of one of those places where I plant my flag and we'll see if it gets kicked down in a couple years, but I don't think so. I think that this as you put it is the future of new media and internet studies. It has to be interdisciplinary in order to make sense even. I can't do it without going outside my discipline.
Yeah, and I think that internet studies and digital studies as it exists also needs to push harder into the interdisciplinarity, particularly I think when it comes to looking at non-white intellectual paradigms. I keep coming back. If you were not familiar with this piece by Callie Tall, The Unbearable Whiteness of Being in Wired Magazine in 1997?
Yeah, 96, 97.
So that was 20 years ago. when white digital scholars were all about the postmodern moment and the how is digital, it's
Democracy
the
and the utopia.
and the fractured sense of self, and it's this realization of all these postmodern ideas. And she said, Du Bois, double consciousness. So Black folks have been thinking about hybridity and fractured sense of self and these issues with subjectivity for literally hundreds of years. Maybe we could look at this literature, and 20 years later I could name on my hand the number of people who have done that, because I cite them all.
So this kind of push to think about what other disciplines have done. One of the things that's interesting in sociology right now is that folks are very much enamored with big data. And Twitter.
Not just sociology.
Yeah,
I speak as a sociologist.
it's everyone.
Yeah.
Right? And so thinking about the fascination with big data, sociology, but more broadly, a lot of the ways that we approach big data is that it's a really quantitative approach that sometimes doesn't look at all of the kind of contextual issues that all of you have brought up. Twitter, as it produces enormous amounts of data by the time we finish this conversation, right?
Yeah.
Continues to create this interest because it's so big and it's so vast. But what happens if we don't contextualize it? Like, how do we deal with the fact that folks are content sometimes with just counting it? All of you take a qualitative approach that looks at discourse, that looks at context. What is the danger if that's not done?
Well, I think you just answered your question in asking the question. There is this, people are enamored of big data, and in part it's problematic because we need to contextualize that data. I make the argument over and over again. If you're familiar with the work of Lori Kendall, who's an internet scholar, I was at a conference one time and she referred to ethnographic work and qualitative work as deep data, because people were calling it small data. And she's like, nothing small about ethnography. There's nothing small about it. I've spent 6 years writing my book project, working with the same group of folks, watching their practices evolve. And so, again, it comes back to a matter of institutional necessity. People need to get their pubs out. They need to move fast. And let's be real, I can be honest, if you all can be. Twitter is a lot easier for me to study than anything else, because it's all right there, it's text, I can search it, I can, you can do all kinds of things with it. Podcasts are harder. Thousands of hours, y'all. I've listened to thousands of hours transcribing. There is no searching, right? And I think it's been really, really fruitful, but there are institutional pressures that make that difficult to do.
All of you don't just study Twitter, right? Like, you study podcasts and blogs, you study things other than Twitter, in spite of the fact that Twitter is this magnanimous thing right now. Why?
Well, one, because Sarah was already studying Twitter when I started, so I was like, I'm not gonna. It is part of it, right? Like, for me, I started writing about blogs because blogs stopped being cool to write about around the time that I started writing about it. Everybody started writing about Twitter, and I was like, no, blogs are still really cool to write about. There's a lot that we haven't said about this, and there's a lot that needs to still be interrogated here, and there's a lot of things that happen on blogs that migrate to Twitter, and then, so we can think about, I steal this totally from Sarah, but people don't exist in a platform, right? So, like, the same people who are on Twitter are on blogs and on Instagram, and it's interesting what they're doing in those other spaces, because there's sometimes very different things that are complementary things, or sometimes things that are very contrasting things. So I think it's important to study the other places where people exist as well, but also I'm not trained to do quantitative work very well. I can read it, but I am not trained to be a quantitative scholar, and so I am of the belief that the question drives the method, right? That's what I was trained to believe, was that if you have a question, that's what you lead with, and then you figure out how to best answer that question, and so you should be familiar with various methods so you know what possibilities exist. But as you go further into your career, you're going to go into some areas and be better at some things, and then that will start to drive your question because you know what you can answer. So that's how I get, in some part, to what we do, is that I know what kinds of questions I ask are not usually big data driven questions. I'm not as interested in that. I don't think that they're not interesting, but I'm not as interested in that. And I'm glad that people do all kinds of different work. But I think that if you're going to study the nuances of Black discourse online, that it is harder to do that quantitatively, I think, than to look at the discourse in deep dives.
Well, I would echo what Catherine just said here about the kinds of questions that she has, right? So I agree. I mean, obviously, the kind of methods that you use, the kind of epistemological and methodological frameworks you use are driven by the kinds of questions you have. And I tend to have questions about things that the variables are not borrowing from my quantitative brothers and sisters, are not very well operationalized. Right. There's not a lot of existing research on those areas. So even if I don't know what all the important variables are, there could be things that are that people have overlooked, and I need to actually go to the source to understand. And that tends to be the kinds of questions I end up having about trying to understand something that there's a puzzle to it, and that I don't think that the existing research has a great answer for it. So those tend to be the sort of questions I have. I think that this is one of those areas where I think there could be fruitful partnerships between people who are doing qualitative and quantitative research. So, I always say when I'm teaching to my students, there's I had to have this sort of theory circle, right, where we tend to think about, the sort of traditional ideas about thinking about questions as you have a particular question, and then you look at the literature to develop a hypothesis, and you test it in the data that's existed, and you prove or disprove your hypothesis, you disprove the null hypothesis, and then you move on and go back, right? But qualitative research is just entering that at a different point in the cycle. So we're starting off with the data and developing theories that we're then going back and saying, hey, data, is this theory, is there more stuff going on in this stuff, or is there less? And so I think rather than thinking of these as two separate areas, this is one of those areas for opposing. There's collaboration that can happen, and the things that I develop and understand from my qualitative research could be used as variables that get operationalized in the next survey that goes out, right? And I also think there's a way that we can think about these we see cultural phenomena happen, right? So we might then say, well, and this, I have to say, this is how I ended up doing my early research that looking at, this is from graduate school, right, that I was talking to some women and I saw this thing that seemed weird, and I was like, hey, I wonder what the GSS has to say about this. And that was the area, the direction that it went in. So you could be doing something that you're seeing a cultural phenomenon happening, and you could say, I wonder what's happening more broadly about this. How often, I was actually just having a conversation with someone in the room about this earlier today, so I'm not gonna look at him too closely, but but that there could be a cultural phenomenon that happens, right, and you're trying to understand, so this is when it kind of reaches its peak moment, right, but maybe there were things that were precursors to that we missed, and maybe we can sort of look at the big data to see if there's something kind of discussions related to this happening on Twitter sphere before, right? So I think that there's a way that rather than viewing them as separate camps, we can think about melding them together into a happy marriage at times.
I could not agree more strongly. I think we need each other.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, culturally and institutionally, we tend to prioritize things that are concrete because we can show, we can apply for grants and show the exact thing that we're counting and measuring and outcomes.
So I want to make sure that we leave time for folks if you want to ask some questions. So I'm going to throw out one more question that I would be remiss if I didn't ask, given AADHum's mission. One of the kind of critical and ongoing conversations we've been having revolves around ethics and accountability. And so when it comes to conducting research on Black digital communities, how do we grapple with the ethics of working with publicly available discourse, especially given long histories of Black folks' merited distrust of academics and scholars? How do you, in your work, deal with the kind of ethical considerations?
So this kind of connects to the last point for me, is that there is a part of my thinking that shapes, I think, my epistemology broadly, my approach to Black digital research more specifically, about what I'm producing and who it's for, and who I'd be cool with seeing it, right? So if I'm writing about people, am I cool with them seeing what I've written? Am I cool with sharing it with them before it gets published? And there's a difficulty in doing that without relationships sometimes, or without a trust sometimes, because of how Black folks have been studied, rather than being partnerships in study. And so, you know, again, I agree really strongly about this partnership in quantitative and qualitative and critical work and big data and deep data. But what I've noticed and what I've seen a lot of is some really solid distrust of a lot of the big data approaches to doing work on Black folks online. And I think a lot of that comes out of a long history of what it means to be counted and surveilled and et cetera and et cetera. But my approach is primarily that. Like, when I'm writing about a community of people, usually it's a community that I'm connected to in some way. That has been historically how this has worked for me. But if it's not, or if it is, would these people that I'm writing about read this work and be okay that I'm doing the work, even if they don't agree always with my end point of analysis? Am I writing about them in a way that honors what is happening and that is that meets my ethical standard, even if it's not what the IRB's ethical standard is in that moment? Because the IRB will allow you to do a lot of things. And I think that my metric is a little bit different than the IRB. It is not to the extent that some folks, and I think, I'm not sure if you do this, but some folks share their work pre-publication and allow for changes from the people that they're working with, and push back on things that they've written. I tend to share it after it's been completed, but before it's published is kind of where I lie on that spectrum. And I have not yet made significant changes based on someone saying you did this wrong and we don't trust you and this is horrible. But it's my ethos of saying, like, if I shared this, would folks hate me at the end of it and think that what I'm doing is encroaching on a space that wasn't supposed to be public and that they didn't want anybody to see, and do they feel like I'm doing this for ill motives, right? So it's a more of a questioning of myself than of I actually have to do this in order to publish my work.
Yeah, this is why I have an ethnographic component to my work, because I believe in writing with people as much as possible, and that's tricky because it's hard to do that without asking them for a lot of extra labor. So you have to kind of weigh. I tend to, even though I'm writing about communities, I tend to try and limit what I'm citing and highlighting to things that are publicly available. But even with that, I ask. With the exception of my first Twitter piece, which I wrote in 2010, even though it didn't come out until much later. And Twitter was sort of new, and we hadn't been thinking about these ethical questions. Everything that I've ever published that quotes a tweet, I've contacted that person and asked that I could quote them. That is not required by IRB. A lot of academics think that that is excessive, but I'm trying to build and maintain relationships with communities to say, look, I want you to trust me. You can trust me. I care how you see my work and whether or not you are okay with the work that I do. When I submit anything for peer review, I submit it to the people that I've written about. Which again is really awkward because I feel like I just pop up periodically. I mean, a lot of folks know me now, but I'm just like, hey, here's 30 pages, you wanna read this? I feel like I just pop up to give people homework. And I always I'll say, you know, I wrote this, I talk about you, here are the pages specifically where I talk about you. I don't expect you to read it because I know it's a time investment, but I want you to be able to read it. If you have any concerns, please tell me. This is a very ethnographic thing where you write in collaboration with people, and if they say, oh, this conclusion that you drew is totally wrong, I may stand by my conclusion, but there's space for more than one voice in the final piece. So you just say, this was my analysis. When I showed it to these folks, they said I was totally wrong, and it's actually this thing. I don't agree. I stand by my analysis, but then both things coexist. So it's a constant.
It's also accessibility, though, right? Like the places that we publish, often the people that we're writing about don't have access to them, right? So if these require a university login, so part of it, you know, I don't necessarily say that I do an ethnographic approach, though some would say I do. I don't do that. But but I do think that I should share it with folks who otherwise wouldn't be able to log in via their university ID and read the piece, right? So like it's just like a baseline, like you should have access to this thing where I cite you. right? Because I do cite you, and I do say that this was your idea on Twitter or whatever, but like you should see it in print. You know, you should be able to see that.
And I have yet to have anybody raise an objection other than minor things, like I prefer to be referred to as a biracial woman, right? You know, very minor
Yeah.
things. I've never had anyone say, no,
Don't publish
this, don't include my statements.
But I think we're getting close to that place, and that's a whole nother conversation.
Ron, I definitely want to hear your perspective on things.
Well, I mean, for me, this is ongoing research. So like the idea, and where manuscripts are coming to the point where there's this, so thinking about whether and how to disseminate research to the people I'm writing about. Having said that, they're slightly different communities, right?
Yeah.
So at least the discussions that you guys are talking about, you're joining communities where people are having interactions with each other, whereas these are like, the types of communities that I'm studying are publicly posted blogs where there's no interaction component, and people are often like purposefully marketing themselves as parts of the momosphere. So I think the context is very different. And also as a social scientist, I mean, I'm often depicting patterns that I'm seeing in the data, so it's not as much tied to one particular person who I'm describing. So I'm thinking about, you know, the sort of, if there was someone who I was talking about more specifically in the data, who I was like really sort of outing publicly, that's something that, I mean, IRB would not require because it's a public space, but like thinking about how I would feel about sharing that information with them, something to think about as I move forward to sort of analyzing and posting manuscripts. But I do think the context is slightly different. I'm not a part of the communities. There's no community to join. I'm observing them as kind of atomized is a bad word. As individual producers of content that has been constructed with the purpose of having it be public and broadly accessible.
Well, I'll say that all the blogs that I study are publicly available blogs. They have comment sections, and that's kind of what I refer to as like community participation. But they are blogs that are almost always one or two people's blog that are publicly available. So I don't do non-publicly available online content. There are people who do that, and you know, which for me includes Facebook at large. Like I just don't mess with Facebook because while some people's profiles are public on Facebook, the extent to which they understand that their profiles are public or that their comments are public is shaky for me. And so I just, you know, leave that to people who want to wade into that water. But Facebook is a tricky place.
Yeah, and actually I remember having there was a project that I'm working on that's related to this is actually something that Melissa and I are looking at is the rise in sort of how people are thinking about talking to their children about Trump after the election. And you know, many you guys might be a part of this blog, but the day after Trump was elected, I was invited to like a parenting in a Trump era Facebook private group with like a ton of people in it, right? Which would be a really
closed groups popped up.
Closed groups. They were like, hey, how do we deal with this stuff? And you know, there's an impetus to think, oh, this would be a great place to like look at patterns and the kinds of strategies and how they're talking about Trump. But I was like, I was invited to this as a group. Like I wasn't invited. Like there are so many people involved in this that even talking about it, I was like, I feel conflicted about the idea of having been given this private invitation to a very large data set. But that's not the people weren't thinking that that's how it's being used, right? So it was very clear to me that like that was something that that in some ways folks in the IRB might think, oh, well, you know, it's relatively public, but for my own personal comfort level, I didn't think that was a space that was appropriate.
So I just want to open it up for questions, because we got like 10 minutes
And I
left.
just want to say, I think we all have boundaries, right? And I think, but the clear thing is that we all have established our boundaries, and they're all different. And what I just encourage people to do is to have a set of ethical guidelines for themselves, whatever that might look like, right? That is not necessarily in line with the IRB and will differ based on your discipline and your approach, but thinking about those things is worthwhile.
And it might be more than what the IRB, like with each of these people, like, you know, there's more than
And it's contextual. For me, if you say something really racist to somebody on Twitter, I'm not going to ask you if I can use that tweet. I'm just going to use it. But if because you said it on Twitter, you are not part of the community that I am trying to build trust with.
I always think of Black Twitter as an interesting thing because I have this vivid memory of I think it was like a newscaster on to the Day Show, and they were talking about Black Twitter for the first time, and they're like, there are 2 Twitters? How do you log into the Black Twitter? And I myself, no, it's a cohort of people who are talking. Yeah,
There's like a conversation like, does it start at night?
I know Matt Lahr. I don't know one's face, but it was Matt Lahr who was asking the question, and he was like, "What?" I was like, "No, it's not a physical thing."
So if you have a question, I just want to ask you to come a bit closer to the mic.
They can probably
Are
do
you
that.
fine? Go ahead.
So all of you mentioned surveillance in terms of like the digital spaces. So I wanted to know, particularly with this new kind of shift at looking at Black identity extremists, whether or not that will deter, or we believe, right, would that deter folks from being maybe as open in terms of their racial politics online?
Online, I'd say no. In particular spaces, probably yes. I mean, so there's a lot that's happened in years past that has signaled shifts for people to new spaces. And so part of what I've continued to argue is that marginalized folks always find spaces to do the work that they need to do to survive and to do, you know, to move forward. And those spaces change, and they're not always going to make an announcement that the space is changing, but it is part of our task, I guess, for folks who study it, to understand how those spaces shift over time and how they shift to different spaces. So the work that has been done on Twitter maybe isn't always going to be done on Twitter, and that's okay. But this is part of, I think, what you're going to talk about in your talk, girls. I don't want to step on toes too much, but like, platforms matter, and people can shift between spaces, and we have always had covert strategies for minimizing detection, right? And so I'm not worried about the ability of Black folks to continue to do the kind of work online or offline that they have always done and we have always done well. And I would argue have done better than a lot of other folks, because out of necessity, right? We have to find strategies to hide and mask discourse, to strategize, to craft spaces that are separate. And because that is a pattern of behavior over time, I'm not concerned with the ability to continue to do that. I am concerned with the implications of things like that on people's lives, right? That there will be people hurt by things. But I'm not concerned overall with our ability to continue to move forward.
I think we've already started seeing a shift to more closed enclave spaces, closed Facebook groups, private group chats, and just because of the hostility and the harassment that people face. And so I think increasingly we're going to see a greater importance of those spaces. And for me personally, it raises a research question because I think that they're right, they're not public.
They're intentionally not public.
Yeah. And some of them I am part of
right.
because I'm part of the community. So there's going to be, if what is happening on Twitter is no longer the most important thing, I want to write about the thing that is the most interesting, and yet I really shouldn't be writing about that thing. It's not ethical. Yeah. But I also think that academics, we need to not get too big for our britches on the surveillance, because I realize, like, tens of people are going to read my book. Like, it's not like, you know, most of the people that I'm writing about have a bigger Twitter follower than the number of people that will write my book. And there is nothing that I'm going to unearth in my research that the FBI doesn't already know.
Right. We're not breaking the walls down.
Yeah. So to some extent, I feel like I need to think about this ethically out of respect for the community and to maintain trust of the community, and because it's important to have ethics. But I also think most of us are not doing research that's going to actually pose a threat to anybody.
I think that the question of how to study, and if one should study safe spaces is really challenging, because there is important work happening in those spaces, but they're created for psychic reasons. Is that the right word? It's like, not like psychic, but like, like, you know, like reasons to help people who are struggling have a safe space, or where they can talk about something freely and not feel as though it's going to be attacked. I would also echo Catherine's point that, you know, there are ways that Black people talk about these issues, even in front of white people, where they're talking, where the Black people in the audience are hearing very different things from the same words that are coming out of their mouth, right? And I mean, I can give you an example from my own research where people are talking about, you know, and through a community of middle class moms that are diverse backgrounds, saying, you know, I really care about feeling like I have a voice in the school and I can talk to people, and I want my kids to feel comfortable. And those are all things that like middle class moms are gonna be like, yeah, voice in the school, yeah, you know, kids feel comfortable. But I guarantee that like, you know, most of the black parents in that audience here, I hope there's someone black in the administration. I hope that there are other black kids in the class, or kids that are multiracial in the class, and those feel like they're very universal ideas, right? I feel like if I have a problem, is there someone who has a racial and like intelligence around racism to have a conversation about that, right? And so we're having a very generic conversation. So that's just an example of one sort of concrete place where people are saying very generic terms that everyone is embracing, but the people in the audience are hearing it very differently. So I think that that's something that is a continual innovation. That that the audience is different, and the audience also receives the words differently.
And just
Other
not
questions?
everything is for us.
Right. Go ahead.
First, want to say thank you to the panel. This is an amazing space to be able to think about the changes and how quickly everything is evolving. Think about Black digital spaces the way I think about Marlon Reese's work, Black is, Black ain't. So there are two quick questions I had. One was related to the platforms, because I really appreciate, Catherine, how you mentioned how platforms matter. And particularly when we think about Black digital spaces, it's constantly evolving and how platforms get taken up to serve various purposes. To what extent do you think about emerging platforms, like thinking about the evolution of blogging or the blog itself to microblogging, for example, and now the evolution of Facebook and Twitter transitioning, and this is very much in some cases generational, to platforms like Twitter, Snapchat, you name it. To what extent do you sort of think about examining those, what I call sort of digital borderland spaces, right? And then from an ethnographic perspective, we're thinking about folks that are originating this content. To what extent do you interrogate their rationale for why they've chosen these platforms and what purpose they serve and their intentionality around that?
It's a great question. I mean, I feel like we have this conversation a lot about like why people aren't studying Instagram, save Melissa, right, who is doing important Instagram work I'm excited about. But like why people aren't studying Instagram because it's hard, or you know, it's short
Or
answer.
Snapchat.
Or
How do you get access? The whole point of Snapchat is to keep people from seeing things.
Right. Right. So I mean, like, I think there are ways to write about platforms in terms of like, what are the possibilities that are afforded by platforms? How do people work within those possibilities? How do they contest those possibilities? I write about that with blogs and Twitter so far, right? But you could have that same conversation about each platform. What are the affordances? How are people using those and manipulating them? And how are they changing them? But I think there are additional challenges to some platforms if we don't consider that their utility is not the same as Twitter, right? Like, so if our whole thinking about how people operate online is predicated on an assumption about Twitter, which I think it is, right? I think that the way that we talk about how Black folks function online is about how Black folks function on Twitter. And so when we try to apply that to another space, it gets really convoluted to say like, well, can we apply this notion of, you know, counterpublics or something to Snapchat? No. Right? But like, do we have other ways of then talking about what is happening on Snapchat? Sure we do. But let's like be aware of how we can talk about how people congregate sometimes offline in ways that mirror what happens on Snapchat or that happens on Instagram or whatever, but then people are using it for different goals at different times to do different things.
Yeah, we were just talking the other day, about a year ago, Torre published this article that is Snapchat, the new, replacing Twitter as the Black digital community. And I saw, it was one of those question headlines, like, is this thing happening? And I read it and I thought, no. And then his examples, all of his examples were celebrities who essentially used their stories as sort of behind the scenes mini reality shows, like, this is what I'm doing, I'm DJ Khaled, I'm getting lost on my jet ski trying to go see Rick Ross, right? Like, but it was very much in that broadcast model, which we already have language. We have language to talk about parasocial relationships and feeling like you know somebody from watching these snippets of their lives. But he was trying to talk about it in the paradigm of
democracy, publics, whatever that has been floating around Twitter.
Yeah, but to come back to this idea of shifting, I think Twitter is, as I just said, we need to think of other things besides Twitter. Twitter is a really interesting example because it was originally conceived of as a microblog service, but that's not how Black users used it. And then there was a lot of moral panic. Andre Brock has written about this, about there was a lot amongst tech early adopters, white techies, of like, black people are using Twitter wrong.
Right.
They're playing these hashtag games and they're having these conversations
That's not
and
how you do
they're
this.
making jokes, right? But now that's how you use Twitter, right? Our conceptions of the platform have evolved.
Yeah, and I would say this, this is about all platforms, that there's like, there are ways that we think that the technology that's there, we didn't anticipate the use. Like, I doubt anyone anticipated that we would see Philando Castile on Facebook, video chat, right? So there's a way that we have to think about how even the literatures that we're using to help us understand may shift in terms of even the evolution of the platform, and that there may not be a literature that yet exists to help us understand some uses of the platform. And this is why I think that the idea of understanding the disciplinary conventions in terms of citation and trying to get yourself to the promised land, if you want to call tenure that.
I do. I really do.
I mean, I just
let me hold on to that a little bit for a while
but
longer.
understanding there's politics around that there are ways that we can look into other disciplines to think about how they're thinking about these things. They can even say that, like, sociology doesn't have a way of thinking about this, but if we borrow from, something else, and then that can help us expand how sociology is thinking about X, Y, and Z, right? So there's a way that you're both honoring the people who you're borrowing from, but you're also saying, hey, sociologists, you're missing something.
So ladies, clearly we would go on with this conversation. We have run out of time. So just to conclude everything, what would you like to see next in the study of Black folks and all the things that we do, being innovative and creative and hashtag Black excellence online?
Everything. No, I mean, I get really excited, for the space that AADHum provides, because having rooms of people thinking about this all the time is rare, y'all. Like, this isn't what happens all the time. And so to have groups of scholars from different disciplines who are all interested in the same kinds of things and bringing their disciplinary backgrounds and then working together and like collaborating in ways that are really interesting, collaborating with folks who do DH and collaborating with folks who don't, right? Like, that's intriguing to me, the possibilities. Because the possibilities for me, if we are in each other's space and we know what's been done, the possibilities of what can be done next are really much broader than if we are working by ourselves and kind of reconstructing things that other people have done. So I'm really excited about there being a whole generation of scholarship and scholars that are really interested in this, and that I hope will take it past where we thought we would go with it and how far we imagined, which was just like, Black people are online, I swear. It's not just digital divide, right? Like, so getting beyond that is exciting.
I would like to see, in addition to that, which is really exciting, since I've been here one day on campus, and I've already told Catherine, it's like, this is so exciting. There are just all of these people around doing this interesting work, and people just walk up to her and like, hey, I'm so-and-so with such and such organization, and let's collaborate. And I'm so jealous. Yeah, it's wonderful. I would like to see digital studies take Black digital practice really seriously, and by that I mean take it as the avant-garde of digital practice that it is and has been, and not study it as, oh, let's see what we can learn about racism or Black cultural production or marginality, or because when you think about, when you're writing a book as a junior faculty member, you're told to think about where you put it, where it'll go on the bookshelf in the bookstore, like, and a lot of times things about research about Black folks online goes in the like Black culture section, and digital scholars will say like, oh well, I don't do race, right? So I'm not going to read that. And I think that I think you can probably make this argument for other marginalized communities as well. But we have, particularly right now, we have a generation of young Black scholars who are coming up, doing research and engaging in digital praxis simultaneously in really interesting ways. And I hope that that will be taken really seriously as a predictor of not only where we're going, but the possibilities of where we can go with the digital.
Dawn, last
Yeah.
word?
Oh, gosh.
No pressure.
No pressure. Well, I would echo everything that was said. I would also say that I think that it's great that sociology is moving beyond that idea of the digital divide and sort of thinking about how digital communities, what they're doing online. One of the things that I think, an area that I feel like is a growing area in sociology is thinking about issues of visual sociology and how they intersect with race, and that's a new area. But I would also say that this is sort of echoing what you guys are saying to some extent, that there's a way that research on marginalized communities or black communities of color gets sort of ghettoized as in the separate category that's off on its own. And I would really like to see people try to challenge the idea that these are particularized knowledges, right? Because one of the things that I think that is important about focusing and centering our study on communities of colors is that it's not just telling us about those communities, right? We have a tendency to think of it as like, oh, well, that's telling us about black people, right? But what is that also telling us about the norms or the quote-unquote big quotes norms, the frameworks that have existed as natural, as taken for granted, and how does it challenge those, how does it unmake those categories that we think of as being standard? So that's one area where I think would be useful, sort of just thinking about using the paradigms to challenge the status quo. Where
Changing our traditions of attention, theorizing beyond the gaze, all the things.
yeah.
Dawn Dow, Catherine Knight Steele, Sarah Florini, thank you.
Thank you.